Picture yourself wandering the bustling streets of ancient Rome in 67 CE when something catches your eye that sends a shiver through you. There's Emperor Nero casually striding through the forum, arm in arm with a dazzling young woman draped in shimmering silks and sparkling gems, introduced as his new bride. Yet, hushed murmurs trail them because the crowd knows a grim secret. This striking figure at the side of the world's most powerful man was once a boy named Sporus. What Nero did to him stands as one of history's most gut-wrenching acts of cruelty, both mental and physical. Before we unravel these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you're hooked on digging up history's buried truths, give a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more stories like this. Drop a comment below to share where you're tuning in from. It's wild to think we're all connected across the globe, diving into these ancient narratives together, bound by our love for the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another yarn about Rome's wild excesses. It's a raw account of how unchecked power can twist love into fixation, sorrow into insanity, and a person into a puppet molded to feed one man's unhinged desires. The name Sporus might not ring a bell, but his story will stick with you long after the tale ends. Let's begin with the man behind this tragedy. Nero didn't start out as a monster. Early on, his rule hinted at greatness. When he took the throne at just 16, Romans thought they were on the cusp of a golden era. He slashed taxes, bankrolled lively public shows, and even took the stage himself, charming the everyday folks with his performances. But absolute power has a knack for rotting even the brightest spirits, and by 65 CE, something in Nero's head snapped. Maybe it was the endless fear that everyone around him was gunning for his throne. Or perhaps it was the loneliness of being the one guy in an empire of 60 million who nobody dared correct or defy. Or maybe it all traced back to the one person he swore he loved more than anything. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, the woman who seemed to embody everything Nero craved: stunning beauty, a sharp mind to match his lofty self-image, and ambition to fuel his dreams of everlasting fame. Poppaea wasn't just a pretty face in the imperial court, though. She had a keen political sense that made her either a powerful partner or a risky foe. When Nero first laid eyes on Poppaea, he was already tied to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, in a chilly, duty-bound marriage. Poppaea was everything Octavia wasn't: vibrant and bold where Octavia was subdued and shy, thriving in the spotlight while Octavia shrank from it. Their affair kicked off as a classic Roman scandal, but what began as a fling soon spiraled into a dangerous fixation. Nero didn't just appreciate Poppaea's beauty, he was utterly consumed by it, to the point where even his inner circle grew uneasy. Ancient records paint him as increasingly unhinged and clingy during this time. He'd lose it if other men glanced at Poppaea too long at public gatherings. He posted guards around her, claiming it was for her safety but really to keep tabs on her every move. He lavished her with extravagant gifts, jewels from India, silks from China, rare perfumes from Arabia, nearly bankrupting the treasury. But the real telltale sign was how he started bending reality itself to fit his obsession. First, he ditched Octavia, a bold move that turned many allies against him. Then he declared he'd marry Poppaea in a grand imperial ceremony. The wedding was a jaw-dropping display of excess, with Nero pulling out all the stops to show off his devotion. Yet even tying the knot didn't quench his need to own Poppaea completely. He cut her off from her family and friends, surrounding her with loyalists who answered only to him. He ordered countless portraits and statues of her, not just for public squares but for his private rooms, so her image was always within reach. Ancient accounts say Nero would sometimes spend hours just staring at Poppaea as she went about her day. This wasn't love, it was a man who mistook possession for affection, seeing her not as a person but as a prized object meant solely for his enjoyment. Poppaea, for her part, knew she was walking a tightrope. She was sharp enough to see that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her incredible sway, but wise enough to know it was a dangerous game. She used her influence to boost her family's standing, building a web of allies to shield her if Nero's favor ever slipped. But Poppaea had one weakness: she wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike the rest of the court, who tiptoed around his moods, Poppaea held onto her fiery spirit. She'd debate him on policy, poke fun at his artistic attempts, and even call out his performances when they fell flat. The exact details of that terrible day in 65 CE differ depending on the ancient historian, but the outcome never changes. During what started as a typical argument, some say over Nero staying out late at chariot races, others over his obsession with theater, things took a dark turn. Tacitus claims it blew up when Poppaea, pregnant with their second child, called out Nero for prioritizing his public image over his family duties, perhaps pushed to her limit by his erratic behavior. What happened next is still debated, but most agree on this: In a blind rage, Nero lashed out, striking or shoving his pregnant wife with such force that she suffered fatal injuries. Some accounts say it was a single blow to her abdomen. Others describe a brutal attack that left her lifeless on the palace floor. Picture Nero in that moment, realizing what he'd done. The man who controlled an empire, who could end lives with a whisper, who was hailed as a god in far-off provinces, had just destroyed the one person he truly cherished. Ancient sources describe the aftermath as one of the most heartbreaking scenes in Rome's history. They say Nero collapsed onto Poppaea's lifeless body, pleading for her forgiveness one moment and barking orders for her to wake up the next, as if his emperor's voice could command death itself. He called for Rome's top doctors, dangling promises of riches if they could save her and threatening unspeakable punishment if they didn't. But it was no use. Poppaea was gone within hours, along with the unborn child who might have carried Nero's legacy. That moment shattered something deep inside Nero's mind. His grief wasn't just heartbreak. It was a total break from reality itself. His mourning became the stuff of legend. Instead of following Roman tradition and cremating her, he demanded her body be preserved and laid in a tomb grander than any emperor's before. He proclaimed her a goddess, set up a cult to honor her, and spent days whispering to her corpse as if she could still answer. Life at the imperial court turned into a minefield. Everyone had to play along with the delusion that Poppaea was somehow still among them, speaking of her in the present tense and keeping her favorite chair empty at feasts. If anyone dared hint that Nero should let her go, they were quickly banished, or worse, sent to their deaths. It was around this time that Nero's gaze fell on Sporus, a young man who had no clue he was walking into a horror story. Sporus was probably just 14 or 15. Born a slave in the emperor's household and freed as a kid, he'd grown up in the palace, educated for clerical work. That was actually a decent gig for the time. Freedmen in the emperor's service often had better prospects than freeborn folks scraping by. But that privilege came with a catch. Their entire existence hinged on the emperor's whims. They could rise high or be crushed without warning. No questions asked. What initially captivated Nero's attention when he first laid eyes on Sporus was not the boy's intellect, talents, or accomplishments. It was his face. Ancient historians, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, meticulously recorded that Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Nero's late wife, Poppaea Sabina. The striking similarity lay in the delicate contours of his face, particularly the shape of his eyes and the soft, refined lines of his features, which mirrored those of the empress. To the Romans, who often interpreted physical likeness as a divine or mystical sign, this resemblance must have seemed like a twist of fate, a cosmic alignment that carried profound significance. Poppaea had been the love of Nero's life, and her tragic death in 65 CE, rumored to have been caused by Nero himself in a fit of rage, left the emperor in a state of profound grief and instability. When Nero encountered Sporus, likely in the aftermath of this loss, the boy's appearance struck a chord deep within his fractured psyche. In Sporus, Nero saw not just a person but a haunting echo of Poppaea, a chance to defy death itself and resurrect the woman he had loved and lost. It was as though Poppaea's spirit had somehow been reincarnated in the form of this young boy, a notion that, to Nero's increasingly unhinged mind, felt tantalizingly real. Yet, there was an undeniable obstacle. Sporus was male. For most, this would have been an insurmountable barrier, but Nero was no ordinary man. He was an emperor who styled himself as a living god, a ruler whose whims bent the boundaries of morality, reason, and reality itself. This was a man who, according to some accounts, had spent months conversing with Poppaea's corpse, preserving her body in a grotesque attempt to cling to her presence. To such a man, altering someone's gender was not an insurmountable challenge but a trivial detail, a mere inconvenience to be overcome with the power and resources at his disposal. What followed was one of the most horrific and dehumanizing acts recorded in the annals of history, a testament to Nero's obsession and the depths of his cruelty. Nero's plan was not merely to have Sporus dress as a woman or adopt feminine mannerisms. His ambition was far more radical and invasive. He sought to remake Sporus entirely, to erase the boy's identity and transform him into a living embodiment of Poppaea. To achieve this, Nero summoned the finest surgeons in Rome, men skilled in the rudimentary and often brutal medical practices of the time. He issued a chilling command. They were to perform a surgical procedure to alter Sporus's body, reshaping it to appear more feminine. This was not a simple act of mutilation but a deliberate and calculated attempt to obliterate Sporus's very essence, his identity, his autonomy, and his humanity. The surgery, likely a form of castration or even more invasive procedures, was an excruciating ordeal fraught with peril. In an era before modern anesthesia, antibiotics, or sterile techniques, such operations were not only agonizing but carried a high risk of death from infection, blood loss, or shock. The physical pain Sporus endured would have been unimaginable, but the emotional and psychological toll was perhaps even greater. If he survived the procedure, and it's a testament to either his resilience or the surgeon's skill that he did, Sporus would never be the same. Physically altered, he was no longer the boy he had been, and in the eyes of Roman society, he was stripped of his status as a man, relegated to a liminal existence that defied the rigid gender norms of the time. The transformation of Sporus went beyond the surgical. Nero ordered that he be dressed in the finest women's clothing, styled with elaborate hairstyles and adorned with jewelry befitting an empress. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, in honor of Poppaea, and was publicly presented as Nero's wife in a lavish wedding ceremony, complete with all the trappings of Roman tradition. To the court and the public, this was a grotesque spectacle, a parody of marriage that underscored Nero's descent into madness. For Sporus, it was a life sentence of humiliation and subjugation. He was no longer an individual with agency but a prop in Nero's delusional theater, a living monument to the emperor's grief and obsession. The Roman elite, accustomed to Nero's excesses, likely whispered about the scandal in private, but few dared to challenge the emperor's actions openly. Sporus, meanwhile, had no choice but to endure, trapped in a body and a role that were not his own. This act of cruelty was not just a personal tragedy for Sporus but a reflection of Nero's broader reign, characterized by excess, decadence, and a disregard for human dignity. The story of Sporus is a chilling reminder of the lengths to which unchecked power can go when driven by obsession. Nero's attempt to recreate Poppaea through Sporus was not just an act of violence against an individual but an assault on the very concept of identity, a perverse attempt to bend reality to his will. Sporus's fate, though unique in its specifics, was emblematic of the countless lives destroyed by Nero's whims, a stark illustration of the human cost of his reign. Even after Nero's death in 68 CE, Sporus's suffering continued as he was passed from one powerful man to another, never regaining the freedom or identity stolen from him. His story, preserved in the writings of ancient historians, remains a haunting testament to the cruelty of an emperor who saw no limits to his desires. The operation happened in a specially prepared room in the palace. Back then, surgery was crude, using basic tools and weak painkillers, if any. The procedure would have been torture, stretching on for hours, with Sporus likely held down by guards as the doctors worked, his cries ignored. When Sporus finally healed, a process that likely took weeks or even months, Nero dropped a bombshell that stunned even Rome's jaded elite. He planned to marry the boy in a full-blown imperial wedding. The preparations dragged on for months, eating up massive resources. Nero gave Sporus a new name, Sabina, after Poppaea, and moved him to private quarters where he was prepped for his new role. Palace seamstresses crafted a wardrobe of dresses designed to highlight his altered body and hide any masculine traits. Jewelers made custom pieces for him, many using gems that once sparkled on Poppaea. These weren't just decorations, they were chains tying him to the woman he was forced to replace. Makeup artists schooled him in techniques to play up his feminine features, charcoal to widen his eyes, rouge for a flushed glow, powders to soften his face's angles. These weren't just beauty tips, they were steps in wiping out his old self. Hairdressers taught him the intricate styles popular among Rome's elite women, cutting and curling his hair into complex designs, often with pricey ornaments. This daily routine could take hours, involving multiple attendants and hot tools. But the real gut punch was the training in how to act feminine. Instructors drilled him on walking, sitting, and gesturing with elegance, showing him how to hold his hands, place his feet, and adjust his clothes to project grace, not strength. Voice coaches worked to raise his pitch and shift his speech to mimic how women spoke, a grueling task since vocal habits are hard to break. Can you imagine the mental toll? Every glance in a mirror showed Sporus a stranger. Every lesson in how to move or talk reminded him his identity was being stripped away. Every jewel from Poppaea's collection felt like a weight, binding him to a role he never asked for. The wedding was set for spring 67 CE, timed with religious festivals to give it sacred clout. Nero went all out, treating it like a true imperial union fit for Rome's greatest ruler. The ceremony unfolded in the palace's grandest hall, decked out with exotic flowers and glowing with thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding tunes, and servants poured the finest wines and served lavish dishes. To an outsider, it might have looked like a standard imperial wedding. But those in the know saw it for what it was, a chilling spectacle where the world's most powerful man married a surgically altered boy dressed as his dead wife. The wedding ceremony featured all the classic Roman traditions. Vows were swapped, hands were clasped, sacred bread was shared, and legal papers were signed to seal the union. The guests put on a convincing show, offering hearty congratulations and extravagant gifts, all while keeping up the expected cheer. But you could feel the tension in the air, a mix of barely hidden dread, fascination, and the uneasy thrill of being part of something deeply unsettling. After the vows, Nero treated Sporus as if he were a true empress. The young man was given his own team of servants, private quarters in the sprawling palace, and a hefty allowance from the emperor's coffers. He had a fancy palanquin for getting around, horses for riding, and a crew of followers trailing him. But all this so-called luxury came at a brutal price, the complete obliteration of who he was and the endless demand to play a soul-crushing role. Sporus, a young man caught in the web of Emperor Nero's twisted desires, was forced to accompany the ruler to every public event, standing as a constant presence by his side during lavish state banquets and high-profile gatherings. His role was not merely ornamental, he was compelled to embody the persona of a devoted, loving wife in every interaction, a performance that demanded absolute precision. This was no simple act of pretense for Nero's amusement. Nero seemed to genuinely believe that he had resurrected his deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina, in the form of Sporus. The emperor addressed Sporus by Poppaea's name, weaving tales of a shared past that never existed and expecting Sporus to respond as though he were truly her, living out a fabricated history. For Sporus, every moment in Nero's presence was a precarious balancing act, a high-wire performance where a single misstep, be it a wrong word, gesture, or expression, could spell his doom. To survive, Sporus had to transform himself entirely, not only adopting the appearance and mannerisms of a woman but also mastering the art of responding as Poppaea herself. He was expected to react to Nero's nostalgic ramblings about their past, marriage, memories of moments that belonged to another life, with convincing emotion and familiarity as if he had lived them. Ancient accounts describe how Sporus became eerily adept at this harrowing charade, developing an almost supernatural ability to read Nero's volatile moods and tailor his responses with chilling accuracy. His performances were so polished that they bordered on the uncanny, fooling those around him into believing the illusion Nero demanded. Yet, beneath this facade of perfection, the toll on Sporus was profound. Over time, historical records note a shift in his demeanor. He grew increasingly withdrawn, his spirit dimming, his voice quieter, and his eyes heavier with unspoken sorrow even as he maintained his flawless public act. The psychological burden of this existence is almost unimaginable. Each morning, Sporus awoke in chambers meticulously designed to mirror the private quarters of a woman he had never met, surrounded by decor and furnishings that belonged to Poppaea's world. Every mirror he passed reflected a face altered to resemble someone else's, a constant reminder of the identity he was forced to inhabit. Every conversation, whether casual or intimate, demanded that he suppress his true self and slip into the role of another, carrying the weight of memories and experiences that were not his own. The relentless pressure of this double life, living as a shadow of Poppaea while burying his own identity, must have eroded his sense of self, leaving him trapped in a surreal nightmare. Sporus's life was a relentless performance, a cruel pantomime orchestrated by Nero's delusion, where every day demanded the sacrifice of his individuality to sustain the emperor's fantasy. For over 2 years, Sporus lived in this bizarre reality. Things got even wilder when Nero decided to tour Greece, eager to show off his artistic talents at their festivals, where he thought he'd finally get the applause he craved. Of course, Sporus went along, paraded before Greek nobles as Rome's empress. Picture those aristocrats trying to make sense of their conqueror traveling with a boy dressed as a woman, insisting everyone buy into this obvious lie. By 68 CE, Emperor Nero's increasingly erratic and extravagant behavior had exhausted the patience of Rome's elite and power brokers. His flamboyant displays, coupled with a blatant disregard for the empire's pressing political and administrative needs, had sown deep discontent across the Roman world. Governors and military leaders, exasperated by Nero's theatrical excesses and his neglect of governance, ignited rebellions that spread like wildfire throughout the provinces. The Praetorian Guard, once a steadfast pillar of imperial loyalty, turned against him, signaling a devastating blow to his authority. The Senate, seizing the moment, formally declared Nero a public enemy, stripping him of legitimacy and marking him for destruction. With his power crumbling, Nero fled Rome in a desperate bid to escape his fate, accompanied only by a small entourage of loyalists. Among them was Sporus, the young man forced to embody the likeness of Nero's late wife, Poppaea Sabina. Even as his empire collapsed around him, Nero clung to Sporus, unable to relinquish the living embodiment of his delusional fantasy, a haunting echo of the woman he had loved and lost. The fugitive emperor and his diminished retinue sought refuge in a secluded villa on the outskirts of Rome, a temporary sanctuary where Nero oscillated between frantic schemes for survival and melodramatic preparations for his own death. In those final, chaotic days, Nero's mind was a whirlwind of contradictory impulses. Grandiose plans to rally support and reclaim his throne competed with theatrical rehearsals for a suicide that would cement his legend. Sporus, ever present at Nero's side, was drawn into this maelstrom, forced to witness the unraveling of the man who had reshaped his existence into a cruel parody of Poppaea's life. As the hours ticked by, reports reached the villa that Nero's enemies, emboldened by his weakened state, were closing in, their forces tightening the noose around the disgraced emperor. Faced with the inevitability of capture and humiliation, Nero made his final choice: death on his own terms. With a trembling hand, he took his own life, leaving behind a legacy of chaos and a court in disarray. For Sporus, Nero's suicide marked not an end but the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter. As the living symbol of Nero's reign, a young man dressed and treated as the reincarnation of Poppaea, Sporus found himself in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. His existence was both a prize and a liability for the ambitious men vying to fill the power vacuum left by Nero's death. To some, Sporus was a valuable trophy, a tangible link to the fallen emperor that could be exploited for political gain or as a curiosity to bolster their own prestige. To others, he was a dangerous relic, a reminder of Nero's excesses and a potential focal point for lingering loyalties to the old regime. Caught in the turbulent aftermath of Nero's fall, Sporus stood at a precarious crossroads, his fate uncertain in a Rome now torn by rival factions and hungry for new leadership. Every step he took was fraught with peril as the shadow of Nero's obsession continued to define his existence, even in the emperor's absence. What followed was even more heartbreaking. Sporus became a political prize, passed around like a rare artifact from one powerful man to the next. First, Nymphidius Sabinus took him, then Otho, then Vitellius, each treating him as Nero had, keeping him in women's clothes and calling him Poppaea. Under Vitellius, things hit a new low. The new emperor decided to use Sporus for public amusement in the Colosseum, casting him in staged myths involving violence and shame. For Sporus, this was the ultimate humiliation, being mocked and degraded before thousands for their entertainment. Rather than face this final disgrace, Sporus made the one choice he could truly call his own in years. He ended his life, likely with poison, sometime in 69 CE. He was probably only about 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally broke free from the grotesque plague that had consumed his life. His story became a warning about the perils of unchecked power and the human toll of imperial excess. But ancient writers seemed more focused on using him as a symbol of Rome's decay than as a real person with his own story. What makes Sporus's tale so chilling isn't just the brutality he endured, but how his entire identity and freedom were systematically erased. From the moment Nero saw Poppaea in his face, Sporus stopped being a person and became a blank slate for the emperor's warped dreams. That he chose death over further shame suggests a flicker of his true self endured beneath the forced femininity and imperial control. His suicide was both a tragedy and a final stand, a refusal to be degraded any further, even if it cost him everything. The saddest part might be that we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before all this. What did he hope for? What did he dream of becoming? All that was wiped out when he was turned into Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so thorough that his true self vanished. The boy forced to play an empress, enduring years of mental and physical torment, who chose death over more humiliation. His story isn't just a quirky footnote in Roman history. It's a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the strength of human spirit. By taking his own life, Sporus reclaimed the one thing he'd been denied for years: control over his own fate. His story reminds us that behind the grand tales of empires, there are real human stories of pain and survival that deserve our compassion even across 2,000 years.